Hi, this is your friendly, local, dangerous dinosaur again, with another ration of bullshit for all of you non believers and believers both, making commentary on the modern state of law or lack thereof. So I was thinking, believe it or not, the other day that we needed to discuss the idea of mens rea or criminal intent. The bureaucrats have done their best to abolish it so that it can make it easier to convict people to feed the machine of greedy machine of the prison industrial complex, add prisoners and market safety as though it were something that could be achieved, and scam the public. Looking back, you got to go clear back to Roman times, I guess, or even before. But most of the Roman Caesars viewed themselves as God or gods. They told their subjects they were gods. They acted like gods. They could execute and free people. They could have these massive games in these arenas and turn their thumbs up or thumbs down and thereby killing however many people were out there that they wanted to kill. And as God, you could determine whether or not somebody was guilty or whether or not somebody should be punished, whether or not somebody should be executed or done away with. That was the system of the Roman or Napoleonic law. It was the law of a human God, the law of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, etc. It was the law of absolute dictatorship. Meanwhile, up north in Saxony and the German areas, where the Saxon Spiel was the law, and in the area of the Anglos and the Saxons and the Danes, northern tribes, they had a little different view. They had tribal councils, and the tribal councils decided everything. Then a curious thing happened. You had the Christians invading everybody and screwing up nice little plots of rulers who could punish somebody by execution or getting rid of a rival by execution or however they wished. And these priests and monks and various other fellow travelers going throughout the old ancient world talking about this guy Jesus and preaching what they called the gospel, talked about things like turning other cheeks and doing a good turn, and that God should determine punishing, God should determine who's the bad guy, and God should determine who's the good guy. And from that came the idea of trial by combat. Now, under the Saxon Spiel, most civil wrongs were rectified by some sort of award of compensation. So if my neighbor killed my son, he would have to give me a substitute in the amount of cash. And most disagreements were sort of settled that way. But occasionally you had something that were matters of honor or other ideological things that were sort of nebulous. And they had the idea then of guilt. Now, the state, tribes, municipalities, local governments, etc., have never or had never really thought of punishing people just because they did things that were stupid or hurt people or whatever. The idea was to compensate them. The idea of crime was relatively new to the tribal areas and to the very smaller governments, the city governments, the self-ruled city governments, etc. A crime was something that the sovereign considered so bad that he had to step in. So if you had a bunch of peasants out there robbing each other of their wheat crop, that was okay. It didn't matter that much, so long as it didn't disturb the baron or earls or Landgrave's cut of everything. And when that happened, then they had barony courts, Landgrave courts, etc. Now, one of the things that happened with the Christian movement was the fact that for there to be a crime had to be committed by a person with a bad heart. Crime had to be something that was bad in itself, rather than just prohibited bad. So they had two branches, malum prohibitum, malum per se. Malum per se is bad in itself. Malum prohibitum was bad because it was prohibited by some rule, regulation, or whim of a sovereign. Now came the idea of the accusation, and under the Saxon Spiel and the rise of common law, the accused was always confronted by the accuser, or had the right to confront the accuser. Also, you had the right to trial. Now, typically, the religious people thought, well, only God can decide whether somebody's a good guy or a bad guy. The act didn't really matter. Whether somebody was hurt didn't matter. What mattered is what kind of society or group are we going to have as a society or a village or a commune or whatever. So if somebody was just a screw up and kept stumbling over ashes and started fires burning down villages and things like that, he wasn't put to death or seriously punished because everybody knew he was a screw up, the village idiot or whatever. It's when the guy went around and deliberately started fires because he didn't like his neighbor, or he didn't like the neighbor's policy or his attitude or some other thing. When it was personalized. And when the act was bad because you wanted to injure somebody else. And that's when it was malum per se. And the law, up until probably the rule of Richard Nixon and John Mitchell, always determined in the criminal area whether or not the person was a bad guy. So if the person wasn't a bad guy, it was different than if he was. If he wasn't a bad guy, this was a tort or a civil wrong. If he was a bad guy, it came to the attention of the sovereign, the president, governor, whatever. And the governor then had the right to intercede and render punishment. Now, for several centuries, particularly after Caesars were executed, the idea of a sovereign being also a god was somewhat alien to the European nation, or nations, European mens rea, or mentality, or whatever. So at that point, they decided it really wasn't up to a god to determine. God acted in mysterious ways, and what they had was trial. And God would intercede on behalf of the good person and against the bad person. So if you had a person that wanted to stand up for somebody and champion somebody's cause, the theory is God would intercede or intervene in that event and would see that the righteous won, so the champion for the innocent would win over the champion for the guilty or the crown or whatever. So the concept of innocent developed from there. And of course, everybody was considered innocent until proven guilty. And proven guilty could have been trial by combat or various other things, or even dunking, or like they did with witches. If a witch was innocent, the dunking wouldn't affect her, and of course, if she were guilty, they'd be killed. And an innocent witch or an innocent young lady, God would intercede and prevent the harm from happening, particularly death, whatever. So that evolved from trial by combat to trial by jury, where you had a bunch of jurors decide whether or not a crime was committed. And essentially what they were really determining was, is this a bad guy that deserves punishment or ostracization or banishment from our community or not? Or is he just a screw up? Can we live with him if he pays for his damage? Will he learn his lesson by paying for his damage? Or is he bad at heart? Now, up until the 1970s, you had all kinds of crime data where they measured crime and measured criminals by whether or not they were bad guys. You had the general bad guy theory. You had to prove that they were a bad guy in order for the state to take jurisdiction over them. Well, Nixon had other ideas. He wanted to run on a forum of law and order, and the culture at the time had a lot of dissent going on, and the dissent wasn't necessarily bad. So, for instance, you had a bunch of people out there that were anti-war. They weren't bad people at heart, although some people tried to brand them as unpatriotic and saboteurs, etc. But they couldn't really show malum per se. But along with the anti-war protests were a bunch of protests by minorities who wanted a bigger slice of the pie, who wanted recognition, who wanted better lives. These people couldn't have been bad as such. Somebody wanting to get a better job or get equal pay for what he did compared to another race couldn't necessarily be considered a bad person. So you couldn't punish them with impunity and keep the status quo, because a bunch of people were going to complain and that wasn't going to work. So the Nixon administration at that time was trying to sell protection, like Procter & Gamble sells soap, I guess. But the whole Republican Party was saying, let's have law and order, which means vote for us, we'll protect you from all these black and yellow and brown peasants that want to take away some of your income, some of your vacation pay, and your daughters. And we'll protect you from this. And all you have to do is keep us in office and we'll protect you. And we can change things to make it easier to protect you. And we can lock up more people that are a threat and protect you that way. And all you have to do is keep voting for us and letting our pet projects go through, and our pet projects get funded enough to help you and help control people. And it should be a nice little deal. You pay us more money and we'll protect you. And even to promote that, they did what in 1969 or 70, in an article I did for the Free School Journal called Radical Racket. They promoted radicals, and the radicals then got headlines and scared the shit out of all the white people. And was major function was to shake down the public, get more money for law and order and law protection. So during that period of time, we went from a Napoleonic or from a common law jurisdiction where you had to have a bad guy, you had to have a mens rea, to a Napoleonic system where the element of intent was watered down, and no longer did you have a specific intent to hurt somebody or to impose harm on somebody. You had a general intent. If you intended to do the act and the act consequently caused harm, then you were guilty of a crime, no matter what common law said after 10 centuries or whatever. You were a criminal. And as a criminal, then we could put you through our programs, we can put you through our training, we can put you in our halfway houses, we can make you take our classes, we can do all kinds of shit, and really harass you and do it in such a public way that the public feels that they're protected and no harm will come to them because we're tough on crime. I want you to think about that and think about what would have happened if today you had to show somebody had to have a bad heart in order to be convicted of a crime. If you had to really have a malicious intent, if the intent had to be to cause harm on somebody, not just to violate the law, what would we have now? How many people would we have in prison? How many people would be out there looking for jobs because they had records and couldn't find them as easily as others? That's something to think about, and that's something to wonder about. Do we have a police state? I submit we have a police state. We should look at some of these things and look at some of these factors. Can we get along with a bunch of screw-ups out there without punishing them for causing accidental harm to people? Should we focus just on those that want to do damage, the ones that really want to harm people? Should we let the stockbrokers that want to go out there and take away pension funds of the elderly and even their own grandparents and parents, should we let them operate with impunity so that we can get the people that smoke marijuana and take peyote and things like that, which does more harm to our society, the peyote smokers or the marijuana smokers, or the cold-hearted bastards that steal pension funds, or the cold-hearted bastards that feel they can get away with something because they can be distracted, the authorities can be distracted, or they're low down in the priorities of the authorities compared to the radicals, the political activists that want to disrupt things. I submit our priorities are way out of whack, and we should start paying attention to stuff like this. Please send me your hate mail and things like that, because I'm really getting tired of talking into blank walls.